Teacher tells black janitor to solve calculus as a joke. What he does next shocks everyone. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in the empty halls of Lincoln High, a school where whispers of division lingered like dust in the air. It was 6:45 p.m., and James Carter, the janitor, pushed his cart through the math wing, the squeak of its wheels a familiar rhythm. At 43, James had seen enough of the world to know its sharp edges, especially for a black man in a small, predominantly white town. His broad shoulders carried the weight of long nights cleaning classrooms, but his eyes held a quiet fire, a spark of something unbroken. In room 204, Mr. Daniel Hargrove, a calculus teacher in his late 50s, lingered at his desk, grading papers with a scowl. Hargrove was known for his sharp tongue and sharper biases, often cloaked in humor that cut deeper than he'd admit. Two students, Mia and Ethan, stayed late to finish a problem set, their pencils scratching in the tense silence. James knocked lightly before entering, his mop in hand. Hargrove glanced up, his lips curling into a smirk. "Hey, James," Hargrove called, his voice dripping with mockery. "Think you could solve this integral for us? It's giving these kids a headache." He gestured to the chalkboard where a sprawling calculus equation loomed, a triple integral with trigonometric substitutions, the kind that tripped up even advanced students. Mia stifled a laugh, nervous. Ethan looked down, uncomfortable. James paused, his hand tightening on the mop handle. He'd heard this tone before, decades of it. The joke wasn't new, just another jab at his place in the world. A reminder that to Hargrove, he was just the help, not someone who belonged near a chalkboard. But James wasn't who Hargrove thought he was. "I'll give it a look," James said, his voice steady but low, like a river hiding its depth. The room fell silent. Hargrove's smirk widened, expecting a fumble, a retreat. Mia whispered to Ethan, "Is he serious?" Ethan shrugged, his eyes flicking to James. James set the mop against the wall and approached the board. The chalk felt foreign in his calloused fingers, but he gripped it with purpose. His mind, sharp despite years of neglect, began to unravel the equation. He saw the patterns, the substitution, the integration by parts, the trigonometric identity buried in the mess. He started writing, his hand moving with a precision that silenced the room. Lines of work flowed, clean and deliberate, each step dismantling Hargrove's taunt. Mia's jaw dropped. Ethan leaned forward, his textbook forgotten. Hargrove's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. James didn't notice. He was lost in the math, in the clarity it offered, a world where logic ruled, not prejudice. Minutes passed, and the board filled with his solution, elegant and correct. He stepped back, dusting chalk from his hands, and turned to Hargrove. "That should do it," James said, his voice calm but edged with defiance. The room was a vacuum, the air sucked out by disbelief. Hargrove's face flushed red, his mouth opening, then closing. He hadn't expected this, not from the janitor. How do you know calculus?" Hargrove stammered, his authority crumbling. James met his gaze, unflinching. "I studied it. Long time ago." He didn't know Hargrove the story, but the truth was simple. James had been a math major in college, a scholarship student at Howard University, before life poverty, family tragedy, and a town that didn't welcome his ambition forced him to drop out. He'd carried those textbooks in his heart ever since, solving problems in his head during late-night shifts. Mia, her voice small, broke the silence. "That was incredible, Mr. Carter." Ethan nodded, his earlier discomfort replaced by awe. Hargrove, cornered by his own game, muttered, "Well, good for you," and turned back to his papers, but the room had shifted. The power dynamic had cracked. Enter Ms. Evelyn Turner, the school's librarian, a wiry woman in her 60s with a reputation for quiet wisdom. She'd been passing by, drawn by the unusual silence in room 204. She stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the scene, the board, James, the stunned students, and Hargrove's discomfort. Evelyn knew James better than most. Years ago, she'd caught him reading calculus texts in the library after hours, his fingers tracing equations like old friends. She'd never told anyone, respecting his privacy, but now she saw her moment. "James," Evelyn said, her voice warm but firm, "why don't you tell them about your thesis?" The room turned to her, then back to James. Hargrove's head snapped up. "Thesis?" he said, incredulous. James hesitated, the weight of years pressing down. But Evelyn's steady gaze urged him on. "I was working on one," he said finally. "At Howard. Number theory. Got close to finishing before life happened." The confession hung in the air, heavy with what could have been. Mia's eyes softened, and Ethan leaned closer, as if seeing James for the first time. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "This man could have been teaching you, Mr. Hargrove. Maybe he still should." The words landed like a slap, not just to Hargrove but to the room's quiet complicity in its own biases. Hargrove's face burned, but he said nothing. The students, though, were alive with questions. Mia asked, "Why didn't you finish?" Ethan added, "Could you teach us?" James smiled, a rare warmth breaking through. "Maybe one day," he said. "For now, I've got floors to clean." But the spark in his eyes said he was more than the world had let him be. The next day, the story spread like wildfire. Students whispered in the halls, and by lunch, a group of seniors had started a petition to have James tutor math. Hargrove, humiliated, avoided the teacher's lounge, where even his colleagues raised eyebrows. Evelyn, ever the quiet force, slipped James a note. "The library's open whenever you want to teach." It wasn't just an offer, it was a challenge to reclaim what he'd lost. Weeks later, James began tutoring after hours, his sessions packed with students who saw not just a janitor, but a man who defied the world's low expectations. The school board, pressured by the students' campaign, offered him a part-time teaching role. It wasn't the life he'd planned at Howard, but it was a crack in the wall of a system that had kept him down. The tension in room 204 had been a spark, igniting a truth. Prejudice thrives in ignorance, but knowledge can break it apart. James's victory wasn't just in solving the equation, but in forcing everyone to see him really see him. Mia and Ethan, changed by that night, became advocates, challenging their peers to question the biases they'd grown up with. Hargrove, though never an ally, grew quieter, his jokes less frequent. In the end, James stood taller, not because he'd proven Hargrove wrong, but because he'd reminded himself who he was. The school, once a place of division, began to shift, its halls a little less heavy with judgment. Evelyn watched from the library, her small act of intervention a ripple that changed the tide. What do you think? Can one moment of courage reshape a community's view of justice and equality?